Chapter 1. A Stranger by the Campfire. The prairie stretched endlessly, painted in dying gold and bruised purples as the sun sank behind the jagged hills. Wind whispered across the tall grass, carrying the faint smell of dust, sagebrush, and a storm still miles away. Cade Weston's horse, Gunner, shifted under him, ears flicking toward the horizon. That's when he saw her, small figure, moving slow. Like each step was a gamble, she wasn't sure she'd win. She came into view out of the shimmering heat haze, a woman in a tattered calico dress, hem torn and stained, clutching a worn satchel to her chest. Her boots, if you could call them that, were caked in dust and splitting at the seams. She looked up once quick, and he caught a glimpse of eyes that had seen too much road and not enough rest. Cade reined in, studying her. Out here, strangers could mean trouble, or tragedy. You lost. His voice carried over the grass, low and even. She froze, like a deer on the edge of bolting. I'm passing through. Her words were dry, cracked from thirst. Not much to pass through to, unless you're fixin' to make friends with coyotes. He nodded toward the ridge where his campfire flickered faint against the coming night. Got coffee on the fire. Beef stew, too. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering there. And what would you want in return? Cade swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the earth with a thud. Spurs gave a lazy jingle as he closed the distance. Slow, deliberate. 3 choices, he said, tipping his hat back. You can share my fire, my food, or my bed. Take 1, take 2, or take all 3. No questions asked. The corner of her mouth lifted just a fraction, more ghosts of a smile than anything real. All 3, then, she said softly, like she was testing the taste of the words. Cade's brow arched, but he didn't push it. Instead, he led her toward the camp. The fire crackled warm in the twilight, the stew scent mingling with the sharp bite of coffee. He ladled a bowl, passed it to her along with a tin cup of water. She sat on the far side of the fire, her back straight, every movement measured like a cat unsure whether the hand reaching out would pet or strike. They ate mostly in silence, save for the coyotes' call rolling in from the hills and the pop of wood in the flames. Cade studied her through the smoke, how she kept glancing at the darkness beyond the firelight, how her fingers trembled only when she thought he wasn't looking. You got a name? He asked at last. Eliza, she said after a long pause. Eliza Hart. Cade Weston, he offered back. Figure you're heading somewhere particular? Her gaze dropped to the stew. Just away? He didn't press, though the way she flinched at a far-off sound. Hoofbeats, maybe, told him enough. Trouble was behind her, not ahead, and if it was following, it might find him too before long. When the bowls were scraped clean and the coffee was nothing but ground at the bottom of the pot, Cade spread out his bedroll near the fire and tossed her an extra blanket from his saddlebag. She took it, fingers brushing his just for a second. Cold fingers, but there was heat in that brief touch. You keep first watch or me, he asked. She glanced at him, the firelight catching in her hair. I'll trust you, she said quietly. Cade tipped his hat down over his eyes, stretching out with his rifle close at hand. The last thing he saw before drifting toward sleep was her silhouette curled near the flames, blanket wrapped tight, head turned toward the night as if she was still listening for something far off in the dark. And he knew, without knowing why, that whatever she was running from, it wasn't done chasing her. Happed her to shadows in her past. Morning light spilled over the prairie in bands of gold, cutting through the last fingers of night. Cade was already up, coaxing the embers of the fire into a flame, the smell of coffee and frying bacon curling into the crisp air. Eliza stirred beneath the blanket, blinking against the brightness. She sat up slowly, her hair loose from its braid, catching the sunlight like strands of honey. But there was something in the way she scanned the horizon first thing. like a soldier waking in enemy territory, that told Cade she hadn't had a peaceful night in a long while. "Coffee?" he asked, holding out a steaming tin cup. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers grazing his for a heartbeat. "Thank you." They ate without much talk, him with an easy quiet, her with guarded politeness. Cade noticed she ate like someone used to going without, savoring each bite of bacon and bread, as though afraid the next meal might not come. When they broke camp, she walked alongside Gunner instead of riding. Cade kept his pace slow, not pushing. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth, until the faint sound of hammering drifted on the wind. Ahead, the silhouette of a small town rose, a scatter of wooden buildings, the false-fronted saloon standing tallest. "Dry Creek," Cade said. "We'll water the horse, get supplies. Maybe you can find something less tore up than that dress." "I'm fine as I am." The edge in her tone wasn't for him. It was the thought of stepping into that town. The streets of Dry Creek were busy with wagon wheels and the jingle of harness chains. Dust clung to everything, the awnings, the boots, the air itself. Cade tied Gunner outside the saloon. "Stay close," he told her. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of spilled whiskey. Men leaned on the bar, talking in low voices. A card game clinked with coins and muttered curses. Floorboards groaned under their boots as they crossed the counter. Cade ordered coffee for himself and water for her. She kept her eyes low, fingers tightening around the cup. It didn't take long for Cade to notice the shift in the room, a pause in the shuffle of cards, a hush in the murmur of conversation. He glanced over his shoulder and saw why. A tall man in a black hat stood in the doorway, dust on his long coat, eyes scanning the saloon like a hawk looking for prey. His gaze landed on Eliza, and she froze, her knuckles whitening on the tin cup. "Well, I'll be—" the man drawled, stepping forward. "If it ain't Miss Hart." Cade's hand slid to rest lightly near his holster. "You know this fella?" Eliza didn't answer, her lips pressed tight, eyes fixed on the water, like she could drink herself invisible. The man smirked. "Your fiancé's been looking all over for you, darling. You got him worried sick." "Leave," Cade said flatly. The stranger's eyes flicked to him, sizing him up, the smirk never leaving. "Not your concern, cowboy. She belongs to—" The click of Cade's revolver hammer cut him off. The saloon air seemed to hold its breath. "Far as I can see," Cade said, voice low and even, "she don't belong to no one." For a tense beat, no one moved. Then the man's smirk faded. He tipped his hat mockingly to Eliza and backed toward the door. "Tell your new friend he just bought himself a heap of trouble." When he was gone, Eliza let out a breath she'd been holding since he walked in. Cade watched her, the questions rising fast in his mind. "Who was that?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not here." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not where ears can hear." Cade didn't press. But as they stepped back into the sunlight, he knew two things for certain. Eliza Hart was running for more than just a man, and trouble had just marked his trail, too. Chapter 3, the Gunsmoke Warning. The wind had shifted by the time Cade and Eliza stepped out of the saloon, carrying the sharp scent of approaching rain. Horses stomped restlessly at the hitching post, leather creaking, tails swishing at flies. Cade could feel the town's mood change, that subtle prickle in the air when trouble was still near but just out of sight. They were halfway to Gunner when the voice came from behind. "Hold up there, cowboy." Cade turned, slow and deliberate. The man in the black hat was back, now with his coat thrown open just enough to show the polished walnut grip of a Colt on his hip. The street around them seemed to shrink. Folk leaning on porch rails straightened. Poker players pressed against the saloon's bat-winged doors for a better view. "You left awful quick," the stranger said, his smile thin. "We got unfinished business." His eyes slid past Cade to Eliza. "And you, darling, you forget how to say goodbye?" Eliza's hand trembled at her side, the knuckles whitening around the strap of her satchel. Cade took a slow step forward, blocking her from view. "You're not talking to her anymore." The stranger's smirk deepened. "Then I'm talking to you. You got two choices. Hand her over and walk away. Or, well, the other one's quicker." The street went quiet, but for the creak of a sign overhead. Cade felt the weight of the Colt on his own hip, the leather of the holster warm from the sun. He didn't like killing a man in front of a crowd, but he liked being pushed even less. "Reckon I've got a third choice," Cade said. "You ride out now, and you get to keep breathing that." The stranger's hand twitched toward his gun. Cade's eyes locked on the movement, his world narrowing to the space between them. Then steel flashed. The shot cracked like a whip in the stillness. Cade's Colt was already in his hand, smoke curling from a barrel. The stranger staggered back, clutching his arm where blood bloomed dark through the fabric. "You!" The man snarled, teeth bared. "You just made a grave mistake." He backed toward his horse, mounting with a grunt of pain. "You'll see me again, Weston. You and the girl both." The sound of pounding hooves faded down the street, leaving only the thick smell of burnt powder hanging in the air. Cade holstered his gun, his heartbeat steadying. He turned to Eliza. Her eyes were wide, her lips pressed tight, but she wasn't crying. She was looking at him like she didn't know whether to thank him or run. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once, though her voice was rough when she spoke. "He wasn't lying. He'll be back." Cade glanced toward the edge of town where the rider had vanished. "Then I guess we make sure we're ready." They didn't linger in Dry Creek. Cade bought supplies quick: beans, coffee, cartridges, while Eliza stood silent by Gunner's flank, her gaze always on the road. By the time they rode out, the sun was dropping low, painting the prairie in streaks of orange and crimson. For miles neither spoke. Cade kept his eyes moving, scanning the horizon for dust trails. Finally, as the land dipped into a shallow draw, he reined in and nodded toward a stand of cottonwoods near a trickling creek. "We'll camp here, safer under cover." As he unpacked the bedrolls, Eliza crouched by the water, splashing her face, letting the cold run through her fingers. When she straightened, her hair clung damp to her cheeks, and there was a flicker of something different in her eyes. Resolve, maybe. "You didn't have to stand up for me," she said. Cade met her gaze. "Yeah, I did." The night settled around them, coyotes calling in the distance. The fire crackled low, and somewhere between the hiss of the flames and the rustle of cottonwood leaves, a silent understanding passed between them. Trouble was coming, but neither of them would be facing it alone. Chapter 4: Shelter at the Weston Ranch. They reached Cade's ranch by late afternoon, the sun already dipping toward the jagged line of the mountains. The land rolled out wide and open, golden grass bending under the wind. A windmill creaked in the distance, and the smell of fresh-cut hay drifted from the barn. Eliza reined in her borrowed horse just short of the main gate, her eyes sweeping the spread with something between awe and wariness. "This all yours?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with disbelief. Cade pushed the gate open and led the way. "All mine, and the bank's, depending on the month." A couple of rangy cattle dogs trotted up, tails wagging, giving Eliza a thorough sniff before bounding off toward the corrals. A handful of horses grazed lazily in the fading light, their manes tangled with wind. Cade swung down from Gunner, motioning for her to follow. Inside the barn, the air was warm with the scent of straw and horse sweat. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the planks, turning the dust motes into drifting gold. Cade led the animals into stalls, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this all his life. Eliza helped without being asked, lifting a bucket here, handing him a brush there, her hands unsure at first, then steadier as she fell into the rhythm. "You've done this before," Cade remarked. "Not for years." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't pry. By the time they stepped into main house, the air was cooling fast. Cade lit a pair of oil lamps, their glow stretching shadows across the wooden floor. The place was modest but solid. Stone fireplace, worn leather chairs, a long table scarred by years of use. The scent of wood smoke lingered in the rafters. Eliza stood just inside the doorway, her satchel still slung over one shoulder, as though she wasn't sure she belonged past the threshold. Cade noticed. "You can set that down," he said. "Ain't no one to take it here." She managed a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and set the bag on a chair. He busied himself in the kitchen corner, eating beans and frying up salt pork while she moved about the room, trailing her fingers along the mantel where a few old photographs stood, sepia faces of people long gone. "This was your family?" she asked. "Folks. Older brother. All past now." His tone was even, but she heard the quiet weight in it. When supper was ready, they ate at the table with the sound of the fire popping in the hearth. She didn't talk much, but Cade didn't mind the silence. It wasn't awkward. It was a kind of quiet that felt like a truce between strangers. Afterward, they sat by the fire. Cade mended a tear in her shawl, needle flashing in the lamplight, while she watched the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters, carried with it a faint howl of a coyote. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. Cade looked up from his stitching. "Tried it once. Didn't take. I like land that answers only to the sun and rain. And I like knowing a man's troubles can't follow him past the horizon unless he lets em." She glanced toward the window, into the dark. Some troubles don't stop following. Their eyes met, and he saw the truth in hers. Whatever she left behind wasn't done chasing her. The moment was broken by a low whistle from outside. Cade rose and crossed to the door, his hand near the rifle propped against the wall. One of his ranch hands stood in the yard, pointing toward the ridge. "Riders," the man called. "Watchin'. Been there near an hour." Cade's jaw tightened. He glanced back at Eliza, who had gone still, her hands clenched in her lap. "They're just watchin'," he said, more to reassure her than himself. But as he closed the door and set the latch, the firelight flickered over his face, and there was no mistaking the truth. Trouble had already found them. Chapter 5, The Storm Breaks. The sky turned the color of old pewter by mid-afternoon, the wind gathering grit from the prairie and flinging it hard against the ranch house. Cade stood on the porch, hat pulled low, watching the ridge where the riders had been. They weren't there now, but he knew better than to take that as a good sign. Inside, Eliza moved about the kitchen with restless energy, her hands smoothing the same spot on her skirt over and over. She kept glancing to windows, the storm's moan in the eaves setting her teeth on edge. By late day, the dust came in rolling waves, turning the air into a swirling brown haze. Horses in the corral stamped and snorted, and the cattle bawled low, uneasy. Cade's two ranch hands, Bo and Merritt, were checking rifles when the sound of distant hoofbeats cut through the wind. Cade didn't need to count. More than half a dozen. Maybe more. "They picked a hell of a day," Bo muttered, squinting into the storm. "They picked it 'cause they figure the wind will cover the noise," Cade said, shoving shells into his Winchester. He turned to Eliza, who stood in the doorway, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "You stay inside, no matter what happens." Her chin lifted. "And if I don't, then you'd better know how to shoot straight." She disappeared into the bedroom, and for a moment Cade thought she'd taken his warning. But she returned with an old rifle cradled in her arms, working the lever like she'd done it before. Cade didn't argue. There wasn't time. The first shadowy figures emerged from the dust, horses lathered and wild-eyed. The cattle baron's men rode hard into the yard, shouting over the wind. The leader, a thick-set man with a red bandana over his face, wheeled his horse in a tight circle. "Hand over the girl," he bellowed. "No one else needs to get hurt." Cade stepped forward, Winchester leveled. "Ain't happening." Gunfire cracked, sharp and sudden, shattering the storm's howl. Cade dove for cover behind the trough, firing into the shifting shapes. Bo and Merritt took positions by the barn, dropping one rider clean off his mount. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the panicked screams of horses. Cade caught movement at the corner of the house. Two men trying to flank them. Before he could turn, a shot rang out from behind him. One of the men fell, rolling into the dust. Eliza stood in the doorway, rifle still shouldered, her face pale but her eyes locked on the fight. "Reload!" Cade shouted, ducking as a bullet splintered the trough beside him. The battle churned in the dust, shapes lunging and falling, voices cursing in the wind. Cade felt a sting along his forearm, grazed from a bullet. But he kept firing, each shot clean and deliberate. Slowly, the shouts began to fade, replaced by the pounding retreat of hooves. When the dust began to settle, 3 men lay groaning in the yard. The rest had fled into the storm, leaving their wounded behind. Cade lowered his rifle, scanning for more movement. The ranch yard looked like a war field. Fence posts splintered, the trough leaking in a steady trickle, one of the barn doors hanging off its hinges. Eliza stood at the doorway still, the rifle in her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Cade walked over, took it gently from her, and set it aside. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, but her breathing was ragged. "I wasn't going to let them take me." "I know." His gaze held hers, steady as bedrock. "And you didn't." For a long moment they stood there, the wind easing into a tired whisper, the smell of dust and spent gunpowder hanging heavy between them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Trouble had come and gone, for now, but Cade knew the storm wasn't truly over. And from the way Eliza's hand found his sleeve and stayed there, she knew it too. Chapter 6, Firelight Confessions. The storm had moved on by nightfall, leaving the air cold and clean, the stars sharp as silver nails in the black sky. Cade had patched the fence and stabled the horses, but the yard still bore the scars of the fight. Splintered posts, churned earth, and the faint, dark stains of spilled blood. Inside the ranch house, the fire in the hearth snapped and hissed, throwing warm light over the room. Cade sat in his chair, boots off, a bottle of whiskey within reach. Eliza sat across from him, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, her hair falling loose after the wind's abuse. Neither spoke for a while. The crackle of the fire and the ticking of the mantel clock filled the quiet. "You've got a good place here," she said at last, her voice soft. "Feels safe." Cade poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed one across. "Safe's only as strong as the hand's willing to keep it that way." She accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his. The whiskey burned her throat, but it left a heat in her chest that she didn't mind. She set it down and stared into the fire. "Back in Abilene, I thought I was going to marry a good man. Everyone did. Handsome, rich, generous in public. But when it was just us," she stopped, the firelight catching the tight line of her jaw. "He had a temper, a bad one, and when he got angry, he made sure I remembered it." Cade's gaze sharpened, but he didn't interrupt. "When I tried to leave, he told me he owned me, that no one would believe me if I said otherwise. And the worst part," her voice broke just slightly, "was knowing he was right." She laughed once, bitter and short, "until I ran anyway." She glanced up then, expecting pity or judgment. Instead, Cade leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "A man like that ain't worth the dirt on his boots. And anyone who thinks he is, they ain't worth listening to." The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind brushed against the shutters like an old friend. "What about you?" she asked. "You got all this land, this house, and still you're out riding alone with nothing but your horse for company. What happened to your family?" Cade looked down into his whiskey, swirling it once before answering. "Folks died when I was young. Brother, too. Got shot in a dispute over a water line. Something stupid." He shook his head slowly. "After that, it was just me. Tried drifting. Thought maybe I'd find a place somewhere else. But the land here, it gets in your blood. Keeps you." Eliza studied him in the firelight. The faint scars on his hands, the steady set of his shoulders. "You must get lonely." Cade's eyes met hers, steady as the horizon. "Not tonight." Something passed between them then, unspoken but heavy in the air. The firelight softened the sharp lines of his face, and the flicker painted her skin gold. Her hand slid free of the blanket, resting on the arm of his chair, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her fingers. He reached over, covering her hand with his. She didn't pull away. In that moment, with the wind outside and the fire casting shadows on the walls, the danger that still lingered felt far away. "Whatever's coming," he said quietly, "we'll face it together." She leaned closer, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and kissed him. Slow, hesitant at first, then with a quiet certainty. It wasn't the desperate kiss of two people afraid they'd never see morning. It was a promise. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his, her voice just above a whisper. "I believe you." The fire burned low, but the warmth between them lingered, stronger than the storm outside, stronger than the shadows waiting on the horizon. Chapter 7, Choosing All Three. Dawn came blood-red over the horizon, the kind of sunrise that made the air feel sharper, heavier. Cade was already saddled, rifle laid across Gunner's saddle horn. When he spotted them, dark specks on the eastern ridge, moving in a slow, deliberate line. Even at this distance, he knew the cattle baron had come. Inside the ranch house, Eliza was at the window, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't ask if it was them. She already knew. "How many?" she asked. "Dozen, maybe more," Cade said, "and their boss's riding point." The name alone, Victor Harlan, made her jaw clench. Cade saw the flicker of fear, but there was steel behind it now, too. Bo and Merritt were already in the yard, checking ammunition. The dogs barked from the porch as the riders drew closer, their silhouettes sharpening against the rising sun. When they stopped just short of the corral, Cade stepped forward, his boots crunching in the frost. Victor Harlan was a tall man, with silver hair tucked under a black hat and a coat too fine for trail dust. His eyes found Eliza immediately, and his smile was like a knife's edge. "Darling," he drawled, "you've had your fun playing outlaw. Time to come home." Eliza stepped out from behind Cade before he could stop her. "I was never yours to take home, Victor. Not then. Not now." Harlan's smile didn't falter. "You think this drifter can keep you? He can't even keep his own land when I decide I want it." He turned his gaze to Cade. "Last chance, cowboy. Hand her over, and I'll ride away. You'll be rid of both me and the debt on this place." Cade's voice was calm, but it carried like a bell. "You ride away empty-handed, or you don't ride away at all." The men behind Harlan shifted in their saddles, hands brushing the butts of their pistols. The world seemed to narrow to the space between the two men. Even the wind had gone still. Then Harlan's hand twitched toward his holster. Cade moved faster. The crack of his Colt split the air, and Harlan's gun clattered to the dirt before he could fire. The old man sat frozen in the saddle, staring down at the bullet hole punched clean to the wood of his holster and the torn skin of his thigh beneath. "Next one," Cade said evenly. "Aim for your gun." Harlan's men looked at each other, Reading the odds and the steady barrels aimed their way from Cade, Bo, and Merritt. One by one, they reined back, spurring their horses away until only Harlan remained. With a snarl, he wheeled his mount and rode off, clutching his leg, the dust from his retreat hanging low over the ground. When they were gone, the yard felt too quiet. Cade holstered his gun and turned toward Eliza. She was standing where she'd been, hands fisted in her shawl, eyes fixed on him like she wasn't sure he was real. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. "It's done," he said. She shook her head. "No, men like him don't stop." "Then neither do I," Cade said, and there was something in his voice, steady, certain, that made her shoulders loosen for the first time in days. He looked down at her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You can share my fire, my food, or my bed," he said, echoing the night they'd met. This time, there was no hesitation in her smile. "All 3, she answered, her voice soft but sure. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the ranch yard as Cade took her hand. The dogs settled at their feet, the horses in corral tossing their heads against the morning light. Somewhere beyond the hills, the dust from Harlan's retreat was already fading into nothing. But here, on this land, with the scent of wood smoke drifting from the chimney and the warmth of her hand in his, Cade knew the fight had been worth every bullet. And Eliza knew she'd finally chosen the right man to stand beside, through fire, through food, and through every bed they'd share in the days ahead. The sun was sinking low, spilling molten gold across the open plains, turning the dust in the air into drifting fire. The wind carried the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush, and somewhere far off, faint saloon music mingled with the cry of a lone coyote. Cade and Eliza stood at the fence line, side by side, watching the cattle graze in the last light. Gunner stamped softly behind them, his reins loose, head bowed in the evening calm. "It's quiet," Eliza said, her voice almost lost the wind. "I didn't think I'd ever have this again." Cade looked at her, his eyes steady on the brim of his hat. "You've got it now. And you've got me, if you'll have both." She turned toward him, the sunset painting her hair in amber and fire. "I chose all 3 that night by your campfire," she said with a smile that reached her eyes this time. "Your fire, your food, and your bed. I still do." He reached for her hand, rough palm closing around hers. "Then I reckon we're home, darling." Behind them, the prairie stretched forever. Before them, the night waited, full of stars, full of promise. And as the sun dropped below the horizon, Cade tipped his hat, leaned down, and kissed her slow, sealing the promise they'd fought for. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke from the chimney back toward them, and the ranch, their ranch, stood firm against the coming dark.